Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third day of our Fall Science of Reading webinar week, Comprehension Connections, Building the Bridge Between Reading and Understanding. My name is Victoria, and I'm on the literacy team here at Amplify. Every day this week, we are hosting webinars at 3 p.m. Eastern, 12 p.m. Pacific, exploring reading comprehension. Today's session is being recorded, and we'll share out that recording link via email later this week. If you'd like to access closed captions, please click on the CC button in the bottom tray and then show captions. You'll also receive a certificate of attendance for all sessions you join live, including today's. Be sure to register for the rest of the series at amplify.com/fall SOR webinars, even if you can't make all of them. We'll send out the recording links for all the webinars you register for. And if you could go ahead and click to the next slide, that'd be great. As you can see, tomorrow we're hosting a webinar on comprehension in middle school, which is a really interesting topic. That's going to be tomorrow, October 2nd, 3 p.m. East, 12 p.m. Pacific, and then we're going to wrap up the series on Friday with finding the missing link in reading comprehension to boost literacy success. Also an extremely interesting topic, October 3rd, 3 p.m. East, 12 p.m. Pacific. And then, of course, if you missed any of the sessions from earlier this week, you're welcome to view those on demand. We welcome comments in the chat throughout the presentation. And to start, I'd love to know where everyone is joining us from on this beautiful fall day. I'm in Cleveland, go Guardians. I'd love to hear where everyone else is joining from. And then without further ado, while we're hearing for where everyone else is joining, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers today. So if you could click to the next slide. So thank you for joining today's session, Where and How to Measure Comprehension to Drive Improvement, presented by Amplify's own Dr. Danielle D'Amico and Dr. Gina Biancarosa. Dr. Danielle D'Amico is the Executive Director of Learning Science at Amplify, where she serves as a subject matter expert in the area of early literacy and develops and conducts research on early literacy assessments, instructional programs, interventions, and professional development supports. Her specific area of interest is in the implementation of systems of literacy assessment and instruction and intervention to support the needs of all learners. Prior to joining Amplify, Danielle was an assistant professor in special education and director of the Educational Assessment and Intervention Services Center at Montclair State University. Dr. D'Amico has an MS in special education and a PhD in school psychology from the University of Oregon. She completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Welcome, Danielle. And then we're so thrilled to have Dr. Gina Biancarosa, who is the Anne Swindells Chair in Education and professor at the University of Oregon. Her research focuses on measuring reading comprehension and tracking reading growth over time. She's best known for creating key tools like the widely used Dibbles 8th edition and MoCCA diagnostic measures. She holds degrees from the Harvard Graduate School of Education and completed a fellowship at Stanford University. Welcome, both of you. I'm going to go ahead and pass this over to you.
Thank you so much. We are so excited to be here and hope we give you some information that you can use in your classrooms. So I'm going to start us off by defining some really commonly used terms so that we're all on the same page. And we'll start with the big one. What is reading comprehension? There are many, many definitions out there, but we decided to use one that you've probably heard if you've been listening to any of Amplify's webinars or podcasts on comprehension. It's a definition from Sharon Vaughn, and I'm sure you're all familiar with her, but she's a very well-known researcher in the area of effective interventions for students with various needs. And her definition is this. Comprehension is an outcome, and it's based on being able to read words accurately, know what they mean, have adequate background knowledge, and also be able to make inferences. So let's just take a minute to break that down. I'll give you a second to read it again. But comprehension is an outcome, is how she starts. It's what we do with a text, but it also requires being able to do many things while we're reading. Being able to read words, know what they mean, have adequate background knowledge, and make inferences. So comprehension involves doing a lot of things while you are reading. We're going to dig in a little bit not a little bit, a lot into making inferences in just a bit. But before we do that, I want to emphasize here from this definition, and that will be really important throughout our discussion today, that reading comprehension is both a process and a product. It's the understanding of a text after you read, but it requires you to be doing many things while you are reading to get there. So it's really important, and a key thing to keep in mind as we're thinking about measuring comprehension. And as I mentioned, one of those major processes is making inferences. So we're going to spend a lot of time there today. But before we do that, let's define what we mean by inference too. An inference is defined by our friend Gina here in a recent chapter as the conclusion that a reader draws from explicit information in a text and sometimes from implicit information in the reader's background knowledge. So making inferences often requires background knowledge relevant to the situation, and it requires the use of that background knowledge or that information to flesh out a more full understanding of the situation or of the text. So it's not enough to just have the background knowledge. We have to be able to integrate that information with what we're reading to make conclusions. So an inference is really about taking information, putting it together, and making conclusions about what we're reading in order to develop that mental model of text or comprehend what we're reading. And again, another important term to define here, and Gina's defined that for us as the conceptual understanding that a reader builds from a text. We take the information and most of the time, a lot of the time, some background knowledge, put it together to make that mental model or to comprehend. And again, we're not doing that just after we read a text, we're doing that while we're reading. We're doing that along the way. It's a process of comprehension. So let's take a look at a short story to better understand how inferences work. And let's pretend we have a teacher, Mrs. Lynn, using this story in her classroom. I'll read the story to you. It's a short one. Toby wanted to get Chris a present for his birthday. He went to his piggy bank. He shook it, and there was no sound. So when Mrs. Lynn asks her students what they understood about the story, they give very different answers. Let's take a few examples. So the first student, Pablo, repeats the story back, something like, Toby wanted to get Chris a gift and shook his piggy bank, and it didn't make any noise. And when Mrs. Lynn asks him for more information, he doesn't have anything to add. Let's take another student, Sharissa, who says that Toby and Chris were friends. So Toby wanted to buy Chris a birthday gift. Toby shook his piggy bank to see if he had any money to buy the gift with, but the bank was empty. Toby was broke. He doesn't have any money. So based on their responses, we can see that both students comprehended the story to a certain extent, but Sharissa clearly understood it much more fully than Pablo did. So let's take a look at the story again. We notice, like any good story, not every detail is spelled out explicitly. We know authors often leave information out as they're writing. For example, the story doesn't say explicitly that Toby wanted to buy Chris a gift or that he kept his money in a piggy bank. It's also not explicit that he didn't have money. Most likely, you all were like Sharissa and understood these things right away. You were probably able to make the same inferences about how the events of this story relate to Toby's overall goal of getting a gift for Chris. And you probably made these inferences without really thinking about it or not really even being aware of the inferences that you were making. But it's important to keep in mind that this type of inference making doesn't always come automatically to our young readers, which is what we see in the case of Pablo. For Pablo, the story was more like a set of disconnected facts. He likely doesn't understand that readers interact with text to make meaning, or he may not have had the background knowledge he needed to make the inferences. Sharissa, on the other hand, interacted with the text. She inferred the missing details, like that Toby was aiming to buy a gift for Chris, that people keep money in a piggy bank, and that no sound meant the piggy bank was empty. There are other inferences that a student might make while they're reading that aren't necessary for the text to make sense. So if you think back to Sharissa's response, she also inferred that Toby and Chris were friends, but they could be cousins, they could be classmates. That's not as needed to really understand the meaning of the text overall. So let's imagine a third student, Ellie, who infers that Toby and Chris were the same age and classmates. She infers that Chris is a boy, not a girl, that the piggy bank was ceramic, that Toby kept his piggy bank on top of a tall dresser. So each of these inferences, like Sharice's one about Toby and Chris being friends, could enrich the understanding of the story, but they're not required to really understand the heart of the story. They're not necessary to make sense. So here's a summary of common student responses to text, keeping in mind that the goal is to interact with the text to build a coherence or to build that mental model while reading. So some students may make those causal inferences. There are some students who may make inferences that are not necessary for the text to make sense, or there could be students who repeat the story back or paraphrase. These responses to text have been confirmed with a great deal of research where students are asked to think out loud while they're reading. Um, so that we know that these are real things that students do, and they do them pretty commonly. And I'm sure you can see how it would be really helpful to know how each of your students is responding to text and whether or not they're making those causal inferences to help you with next steps for instruction. So we're going to keep this in mind as we think about reading comprehension assessment, and I will turn it over to Gina now.
Thanks, Danielle. So I'm going to talk about specifically the heart of our talk today, which is assessing reading comprehension. And you can go to the next slide. And one thing that I really like to emphasize with folks when I'm talking about reading comprehension assessment is that it really hasn't changed very much at all since the 19th century. So predominantly what we do is we ask questions. And specifically, we still rely heavily on multiple choice questions. So what I want to emphasize about the issue with asking questions is that it treats reading comprehension as a product rather than a process. And what that means is that comprehension is assessed only after reading is done, and the mental model, we don't gain any insight into how the mental model was constructed or what inferences were made spontaneously. We only understand what a student understands in response to a question after they're done reading. Next slide. So this is probably a very familiar, if not traumatic, image for some of you. But a major technological innovation in the last century was scannable answer sheets, where we could ask multiple choice questions and actually get all of the answers onto a single sheet of paper and scan it with a device so that we didn't have to go through question by question in a booklet. Although we have modernized since then, you can go to the next slide, we are still asking questions, multiple choice questions. So this is a sample question passage or part of a passage and an item from the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that test, it's a state test in about 10 different states across the country. And you can see here that what the child is being asked is what conclusion about James is supported by the text. So they're being asked what inferences they may be made about James. But the issue here is that we don't know that they made any inferences about James as they were reading. Rather, all we really know is how they respond to this question. So even with modern approaches to reading comprehension testing, we're still relying on this product approach to measuring comprehension. And so just to reiterate, the problem with asking questions is that we have no way of knowing whether a correct answer was a spontaneous product of the reading process or if it was actually a product of a question being asked. So here we wouldn't know if a reader who selected the right answer did so because they inferred that James enjoyed learning new things as they were reading, or if they simply just chose among the conclusions here the one that they thought sort of post hoc best fit the passage. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that assessments like the Smarter Balanced assessment have introduced new ways that students can demonstrate their understanding that aren't exactly multiple choice questions, but they still rely again on asking questions. So here what we have is an interactive piece of text where the student is asked to click on the sentences in the excerpt from the passage in order to support the idea that James formed new ideas for what STEAM might do in order to help humans. And this is in some ways very exciting. There's a certain amount of interactivity with text that this kind of technological innovation supports that simply wasn't possible before. Now, the student clicks on the sentences that they think support a conclusion, but the problem with asking a question remains. We don't know that the student spontaneously came to the conclusion that James was forming new ideas about STEAM, as opposed to only really realizing that, oh, that's a conclusion that I must now find support for simply because the question has been asked. So what we don't know is whether they understood that Watt's ideas were new at all spontaneously. How do we get at the process of comprehension then? Well, both of those examples from the Smarter Balanced are what I would consider inference questions. And so remember that an inference is a conclusion that contributes meaning to a mental model that is not explicit in the text. And there's actually a great number of inferences that we make while we're reading. And so I'm going to sort of belabor this for a moment, if you'll forgive me. But there are three sort of superordinate classes of inferences that we can make. There are word meaning inferences, there are coherence inferences, and there are elaborative inferences. And when Danielle was giving us the example of the story about Toby, we heard some examples of coherence and elaborative inferences, but there are also inferences at the level of the word. So a lexical inference is an inference where a student looks at the word itself and uses word parts in order to figure out what the word means. So it's almost a form of morphological analysis, if you will, as opposed to a context clue inference, where the inference is being made using the surrounding text in order to figure out what a novel word means. And finally, there's anaphor resolution. And this is, an anaphor is something like a pronoun or primarily pronouns, where we are inferring what thing that came before in the passage that pronoun is now referring to. So in the Toby passage, when we see he, we are inferring that he refers to Toby. And that is, again, an inference that we probably all made completely automatically and unbeknownst to ourselves, in the sense that it was so automatic that we weren't even conscious of making that inference. Now, in contrast, coherence inferences are really particularly about integrating pieces of information to gain meaning from the text that is not explicit. And this sometimes relies on drawing on background knowledge, but not always. So a bridging coherence inference is where we are literally bridging information in the text. We're connecting information that might be relatively close together. We would call that a near bridging inference versus a far bridging inference where we might be realizing that something we just read connects to something we read maybe in the paragraph before. So bridging inferences are really critical to building a coherent understanding of the text that we are reading. And so if we kind of go back to the example of Pablo and the Toby passage, for Pablo, it's not even clear that he was making bridging inferences. The way that he responded to the teacher, he sort of recited the ideas that were in the text without any kind of connective tissue, if you will. And so it remains unclear whether he was even making bridging inferences. The next kind of coherence inference is a gap-filling inference. And these are the inferences where we sort of infer that, oh, well, Toby wants to get a present, but since he's gone to his piggy bank, he must want to buy a present. Similarly, that if the piggy bank made no sound, that therefore the piggy bank must be empty. So these are gap-filling inferences that where we draw on background knowledge in order to kind of fill in between the lines, if you will, in the text, in order to come up with a coherent mental model that is truly motivated. Causal inferences are an even more specific kind of gap-filling inference. They are very specific to identifying the causes or causal relationships in a text. So realizing that that it was the fact that Toby wanted to get Chris a birthday present that motivated his movement toward the piggy bank and the shaking of the piggy bank, that these things are causally related. He wouldn't have shook his piggy bank if he didn't want to buy a gift. And so these are often called explanatory inferences. They're ways that we explain to ourselves how ideas in the text are connected. And so again, these are really central to maintaining a coherent mental model of what we're reading as we're reading. Now, elaborative inferences are really more what the third student, whose name is now going to escape me, but the third student that Danielle talked about. And these are inferences that are nice to have. They enrich our understanding of a text, but they're not necessary in order to build that coherent mental model. And all I mean by that is that they're extra, right? And that's what we mean by enriching the text. They can help us visualize what we're reading, like the inference that perhaps the piggy bank was kept on a high dresser. You could kind of even visualize Toby walking into the bedroom and reaching for the piggy bank. These are things that make our understanding of the text really elaborated, to use the term elaborative in another form. But again, they're not essential. If we don't make that inference, we're still going to understand the text as long as we're making those bridging, gap-filling, and causal inferences. So a knowledge-based inference is where we are connecting discrete background knowledge to the text. So again, the student who inferred that maybe Toby kept his piggy bank on the top of a dresser maybe made that inference because that's where they keep their piggy bank. A schema-based inference, though, has to do more with situational knowledge, right? And so when we think about the situation of wanting to buy someone a gift, there are additional things that we might sort of activate in our minds that, oh, it's likely Toby is going to go to the store. That isn't relevant yet, so it isn't strictly necessary yet, but it certainly can help, again, with enriching that representation in one's mind. And then finally, text connecting inferences are inferences that we don't often get at in reading comprehension assessments, although assessments like the Smarter Balance do get at them. Text connecting inferences are not about bridging within a text the way the coherence inference is. They're about connecting across texts. So making elaborations based on something that we've read somewhere else. Next slide, please. So importantly, when we look at most reading comprehension assessments, I just went through 9 different sort of flavors of inferences that one might make. But when we look at how tests describe, most tests describe the content of the measure, they just talk about inference questions. They don't distinguish amongst all of those different types of inferences. Although sometimes they will hold the word meaning inferences separate from the rest of the inferences. And so here, what we have is an excerpt from a table from the report Measure for Measure, which was published by the Carnegie Corporation over a decade ago, but still remains one of the sort of most interesting to me kind of comparisons among commercially available reading comprehension measures. And so what you can see here is that there's not a lot of variability in terms of the degree to which these tests are measuring inferences. They all have an H, which means they have a high number of questions that qualify as measuring the ability to make an inference. But what they can't do is tell us what kinds of inferences a student might be doing better at or worse at. And if we want to improve a student's ability to make meaning as they read, understanding where the breakdown is, whether the breakdown is with those elaborative inferences versus the coherence inferences, then we're going to need to look beyond these kinds of commercial achievement tests of reading, if you will. So next slide, please. So in the chapter that Danielle referred to, I review a number of assessments that target inferencing specifically. And so here you can see a table sort of summarizing 4 of those measures that I'll give you some sample items from in a few moments. We've got the Bridget, which is available both in a picture version and in an all text version. The picture version is for grades 2 to 6. Whereas the text version is for grades 6 to 12. Both take about 20 minutes to give and have slightly different numbers of items. Both are assessing both those bridging coherence inferences and the gap filling coherence inferences. And I have contact info here just in case people are interested in learning more about any of these measures. Marcia Barnes is a professor at Vanderbilt University and is one of the fine minds behind the Bridget. Then we have the MoCCA, which, full disclosure, I am one of the fine minds behind. MoCCA is an assessment specifically of those causal inferences. And my co-authors and I kind of saw a real gap in what was out there in terms of assessments. And so we really wanted to hone in on those causal coherence inferences. Our assessment covers grades 2 to 9. It takes about 15 to 25 minutes to give. The time varies because the test is computer adaptive, so it may end sooner for some students than others. And it takes about 1 minute per item, so the test varies in length from 15 to 25 items. And if you're interested in learning more, there's a URL there. And then finally, we have the CIRCA assessment, which is really new, but actually kind of exciting because it really uses that, it really tries to tap all 3 types of inferences. It particularly gets at lexical inferences, bridging inferences, and gap filling inferences. And so it's really targeted at the middle grades. It takes about 30 minutes to administer, and that measure is a product of Dr. Nathan Clemens, who's at the University of Texas in Austin. And so we'll look at each of these in a moment, or now, in order to kind of flesh out what these assessments are doing. So here's a sample item from the Bridget. And what you can see is that the Bridget, remember, targets both near and far bridging inferences. And this example here is, it's a classic far bridging inference. So John has a broken leg. He is invited to go to his friend Andrew's cottage. The first day it's raining, so they just watched movies inside. The second day it was sunny, and Andrew wanted to swim in the lake. The boys loved to jump from the tire swing into the lake. But of course, you have probably already inferred that since John has a broken leg, he's not going to be able to jump use the tire swing in order to jump into the lake, because he probably can't get his leg wet. So with that in mind, you have probably figured out that the correct answer here is B, which is why it's italicized for you. It wouldn't be italicized on the assessment. And basically, what makes this a bridging inference is that one has to connect the fact that John has a broken leg to the fact that they're going to be playing at the lake, and the fact that he can't go into the lake. So one of the nice things about the Bridget is it offers two different scores, both a near bridging inference score and a far bridging inference score. And the importance of that is really that near inferences are easier to make than far inferences. And so you might have a student who struggles with bridging inferences altogether, but you might have one that simply, or not simply, but who does all right with the near bridging inferences, but has more difficulty with an item like this, where there's a far bridging inference, where they need to remember what comes earlier in the passage. So here we have an example from the CIRCA, and I should say that CIRCA stands for Connected Inferential Reading Comprehension Assessment. And Connected refers to an intervention that Nate Clemens and his colleagues have developed. So this one is really unique in that it is very intervention aligned. And so it assesses anaphoric inferences, lexical inferences. So all three kinds of lexical, of word meaning inferences: the anaphoric, the lexical, and the context clues. It also assesses bridging inferences, both near and far, and causal inferences. What it doesn't get at are those elaborative inferences. And as you might imagine, because those aren't as necessary for comprehension, they tend to, and people have options in terms of, elaborative inferences. They're not as ripe for assessment. And what I mean by that, just to, because I realize that's a little bit of an obscure statement, is that, remember we talked about the student who inferred that the piggy bank was kept on the high dresser? Well, someone else might have inferred that the piggy bank was kept on an end table, or a bedside table, if you will. And neither of those is right or wrong. So, and that's really a critical aspect of elaborative inferences and what makes them so difficult to assess with a multiple choice question, because there isn't a single right answer. So back to the CIRCA. So here we have an example of another bridging inference. And again, it's more of what we would call a far inference, because it requires connecting information from the first sentence with information in the third sentence. Once you do that, you realize that, oh, well, snowplows are used when there's a lot of snow on the street, but if a very small amount of snow fell, the snowplows were probably not used very much. And so again, that bridging inference enables you to realize that the correct answer here is D, that the plows were likely not used in the winter of 2013. So I'm going to talk about MoCCA a little bit more than the others, simply because it has a fairly unique approach to how we assess comprehension. And specifically, it is based on decades of Think Aloud research, which Danielle referred to earlier. Students with poor comprehension have demonstrated through Think Alouds that they tend to do one of two things. They tend to be paraphrasers, so very similar to Pablo, where they're sort of what I think of as text bound. They're not really giving you anything other than what the text itself explicitly gave you. Versus the elaborators, who are making lots of inferences, but they're not necessarily the necessary inferences, those coherence inferences. So because of this, my colleagues in the University of Minnesota, particularly Kristen McMaster and her colleagues, have developed interventions designed to address these two different approaches to reading comprehension that have been revealed through Think Alouds. So paraphrasers, they've found, benefit from a particular type of questioning approach called general questioning, which is really trying to make them get students to make those text connecting inferences, those bridging inferences. As opposed to for the elaborators, they tend to benefit from a type of question that really tries to stimulate causal inferences. So getting them to answer questions about why did that happen, so that they're making those causally coherent inferences. And what they have found in their research is that paraphrasers benefit more from the first type of questioning and elaborators more from the second type of questioning. And because of that differential response to intervention, MoCCA was really an approach to figuring out whether a student is a paraphraser or an elaborator without having to do a Think Aloud. Because Think Alouds are very time intensive, and they have to be given one-on-one, and it takes all the time to administer it and then more time to code it. So if we could go to the next slide, what you can see here is a sample MoCCA item. And MoCCA items are unique in that they don't ask questions. Instead, the student is charged with, they go through a little training that teaches them that their job is to fill in the missing sentence in each of the passages that they read. The missing sentence is always the next to last sentence, and it creates a causal gap in the story. In other words, it necessitates the making of a causally coherent inference. And then the other innovation is that among the multiple choice answers, we have complete sentences that they need to choose among in order to determine which best completes the story. So if we go to the next slide, we can see the answer choices for this particular item labeled. So the first answer choice happens to be the correct answer in this case. It's a causally coherent inference. The second one is a paraphrase. And the third one is an elaborative inference. So it's a completely plausible inference, but it isn't one that fills that causal gap in the story. It doesn't get Aaron, it doesn't solve Aaron's problem of trying to get on the back of the pony. And what MoCCA does is it keeps track of how many times an individual student is choosing each of these answer types in order to be able to classify them as good or causal comprehenders versus potentially a paraphraser or an elaborator, which I think our next slide deals with. So the results for MoCCA, you actually get two different scores: an overall comprehension score that tells you in general whether the student is comprehending well or not, And then what we call a process propensity score, which is for your students who aren't comprehending particularly well. It classifies them in terms of which of these processes, paraphrasing versus elaborating, the poor comprehender seems to be relying on. And the benefit of that is that it directly informs instruction and kind of connects right to those questioning approaches that my colleagues at the University of Minnesota have developed. Thanks, Danielle.
All right. Thank you so much, Gina. Um, we're going to spend a little bit of time now, maybe taking a little bit of a step back and thinking about linking data to instruction and kind of putting all of these pieces that we've been talking about already today together as we think about the assessments that we're using in our classrooms. Um, we know that in our literacy systems, we use data for multiple purposes. We use data to drive our core instruction, differentiation, intervention, selection, and evaluation. And we want to make sure we select assessments that were designed and validated for the purposes we want to use them for. We also want to make sure they provide the most actionable data possible. And I think Gina gave us a lot of ideas about what an actionable assessment could really look like. Um, there's some other considerations we want to think through. We know that a lot of assessments often will, in addition to really focusing on products, as Gina talked about before, there are many assessments out there that will assess a variety of skills and standards, which is really appealing and really helpful to get this kind of broad understanding of how students are doing. But we want to make sure that we're interpreting those kinds of assessments and the data we get from those assessments in the right way. So oftentimes in assessments like this, there may be a limited number of items for any given skill or standard. So we don't always want to base our overall understanding and make really important decisions based on just one or two items that may or may not be really representative of the skills and knowledge that students are bringing to their reading. And I think, saw it alternatively, there are other assessments out there like Gina showed that really are honing in on something very specific, giving students multiple opportunities to show their knowledge and show how they're processing text versus, answering a bunch of questions that are measuring different things over time. And we also, like we were saying, want to make sure we know how the scores that are produced by any given assessment are validated. So, some tests will give an overall comprehension score, and then they might give a bunch of different subscores for all these different, areas of comprehension, which again is very appealing and gives us information to use, but we want to just make sure we're using that information carefully because oftentimes those subscores, those subtest level scores were not validated. The overall score might be valid, reliable, all of the good things, but a lot of times those subscores have not been validated in the same way. So we want to make sure we're not making really high stakes decisions for students based on those types of scores. So we hope we gave you a lot of information to think about as you're thinking about the assessments you use and how to measure comprehension and how to use that data to inform instruction. But again, just to reminders of a few things. Are the assessments I'm using or you're using assessing just the product of comprehension, or are they also assessing processes that could be really actionable and really useful for informing instruction? Are the measures I'm using validated for the right purpose, the purpose that I'm trying to use them for? Are the specific scores that I'm using also validated for the right purpose? And then most importantly, and I hope you've kind of thought through and seen throughout the assessment, we want to make sure that the data and the information that we receive from our assessments can directly lead to next steps for instruction. There's so much to talk about when it comes to reading comprehension and measurement for driving student improvement. We hope this gave you some things to think about when it comes to measuring not just the products, but the process of comprehension to support your students. Thank you for joining us today. We have a little bit of extra information here. Victoria. Oh, great. Victoria's back.
Yes. Hi. Thank you so much. What a really fascinating session. We got so many questions in the Q&A box. So, well, it looks like we have a little bit of extra time that we can dive into those in just a second. But yeah, as we wrap up, I just want to thank you both again. And also, of course, everyone should subscribe to our award-winning podcast if you haven't already, Beyond My Years, and of course, Science for Reading the podcast, where you will see both of these incredible women on speaking about comprehension in more detail. So yes, I think if we have, oh yeah, this is Dr. Bianca Rosa's episode that will be coming out in a few months, December 3rd. So look out for that. But I can't believe that's only 2 months away. It seems so much longer. And our season 10 of Science Junior, the podcast, just launched with an entire season focused on comprehension. So a lot more that you can learn by tuning in. Yeah, so I think with 15 minutes left, we can dive into, we have currently 17 open questions in the Q&A, which is a lot. So thank you all for all this engagement. It's amazing. I'm going to start from the top. Susan wanted to know, can you address how a student's experience may help build implicit knowledge? Like in the interpretation of the story shared by the presenter, experience also plays a part. She may not have had the experience of putting money in a piggy bank or knowing that the money makes a sound inside a container, like the piggy bank.
Yeah. So yeah, experience in my mind falls into the realm of background knowledge. So when we talk about background knowledge, we're talking not just knowledge gleaned from books, but knowledge gleaned from one's own experiences, right? And so it is that sample story does come from an older text, back when we were not quite so digital with how we access and use our money. And so I imagine, particularly, even 5 or 10 years from now, there might not be a lot of students who have the background experience with piggy banks to be able to make sense of that story. So absolutely, one's lived experiences absolutely inform their ability to make both coherence inferences and elaborative inferences, particularly those schema-based inferences. If you haven't been in a situation like the one you're reading about, it becomes much more difficult to make sense of what you're reading. And there's actually a great study by John Bransford and his colleagues where they looked at two different stories of a wedding, and one was an Indian wedding and one was an American wedding, and they had folks in India and the United States read each other's stories as well as their own, and as you might expect, the American readers struggled quite a bit with the Indian marriage passage, but did fine on the American style wedding passage, and vice versa for those who were in India. So absolutely, one's experience contributes to and supports their comprehension. Victoria, you're muted.
Oh my goodness. I'm so sorry. How do you ever figure out the way children make inferences spontaneously?
Right. So that is a great question. And that is my, because I would definitely agree that none of the assessments that we looked at get at that spontaneous inference making, unfortunately. There are folks who have worked using EEGs to get at that. And obviously, that's not something very practical that we're going to be doing in classrooms. Think alouds really remain our sort of go-to for getting at spontaneous reasoning during reading. Although I would argue even that has uh, interferes with the natural reading process to some degree, because if you're asking someone to speak aloud what it is they're thinking, that's not natural. We don't do that when we're reading normally. So that said, I will say think alouds are the method that we have used to understand reading comprehension, both as a process and a product. For decades. And so everything we know about comprehension, well, maybe not everything, but a lot of what we know about comprehension comes from that kind of think aloud research. In my own research, I'm investigating whether we can use eye tracking as a way to draw inferences about the mental process by which students are making sense of what they read. But that's really kind of in its infancy, and again, not something that we're going to see in classrooms anytime soon. So the short answer is we don't really have a good way to get at it other than through think alouds.
Great. If we want to learn about the definition for each of the different types of inferences, where do you recommend we look?
Sorry, can you repeat that? I was distracted.
If we want to learn about the definition for each of the different types of inferences, where do you recommend we look?
Yes, that's actually what I was distracted by. I'm trying to find the article itself so that I can put the citation in the chat for everyone. So I will keep looking that up and tell you in a moment.
Okay, and we can also definitely share that in our post-event resources that we'll share after this webinar. So we'll add that to that page and in the email that we send.
Super.
Yeah.
Super.
Great. Looking through all these, oh, this is a good one. Can you please speak to comprehension assessments and practice for English language learners?
Yeah, so that is a tough one, because what happens is you can have what we would call in the measurement biz construct irrelevant variance in scores due to the fact that a student is acquiring the proficiency in the English language concurrently with learning to read and read for meaning and what have you. And in particular, vocabulary is often a strong concern because an English learner might not have as broad a vocabulary as a student who is not an English learner. And what we do find on MoCCA, and I wrote this in a response to someone in the Q&A, is that on MoCCA, we find that English learners tend to show up a bit more often as paraphrasers than as elaborators. And my hypothesis as to why that is that the effort of making meaning from reading is it's harder or more involved for someone who is just acquiring the English language. So they're not just having to read for meaning, they're having to read for meaning in a language that is not their most comfortable language necessarily. So there are not any comprehension assessments that I know of that really take into account a student's language background. That is something we're planning to study more with MoCCA, but I unfortunately cannot recommend I cannot think of any assessments that are specifically developed for that population. But I think increasingly educators have been demanding this attention. And so I think you'll see assessments in the future come up with disaggregated norms and what have you, so that you can be comparing apples to apples and oranges to oranges when you look at scores.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Here's another one. Can someone address the maze assessment and the potential limitations that teachers should consider when extrapolating the score to provide insight into comprehension holistically, or all these different types of inferences?
Sure. So we use Maze on the Dibbles, which, just to remind you, I'm also one of the researchers behind. And Maze has been shown to be a sort of good, quick but dirty um, snapshot of one's comprehension skill, if you will. It can tell you overall whether a student is comprehending well, but it is really a measure of what I would call comprehension efficiency, because it is a timed test, right? So we only give students 3 minutes to complete the maze on Dibbles, and most maze measures have a similar time limit, anywhere between 2 and 5 minutes. And because of that, you're getting at not just comprehension, but the ease with which comprehension is occurring. And so if I were to see a student who does really well on any one of these assessments that we were just talking about, all of which are untimed, um, versus but that student does not do well on maze, that would tell me that the student has strong comprehension skills, but is not efficient at exercising those skills yet. And so I think it is a good sort of thermometer, if you will, for reading comprehension, but it doesn't give you the full picture. And honestly, no one comprehension assessment is going to do that. So it's important to recognize that each assessment has its drawbacks.
Great. We've seen a couple of questions, people wanting to know how to get access to use these kinds of assessments with their own students. So can you speak to that?
Yeah, so when they share the slides, there are email addresses and URLs in that table. For MoCCA, I know the email off the top of my head. It's moca@uoregon.edu. We make it available to folks for free. And we have ongoing research studies and partner with districts and schools to use MoCCA. So if you're interested in trying it out, gosh, there's over 600 of you in this room. I hope I don't get 600 emails, but be patient. If I do, I will. We will respond to each and every email. But yeah, I really strongly encourage you to consider both the Bridget and the Circa as well. I think that those are both really strong assessments. And one of the nice things about the Circa is its alignment to the connected intervention. And I don't know to what extent that intervention is freely available, but Nate, whose email is up here, would be the person to ask about that.
Okay. I'm looking through so many questions, seeing the ones that have
Mhm.
a lot of thumbs up. Can MoCCA, Circa, and Bridge IT be used throughout the year to monitor student improvement and comprehension with inferencing?
Yeah, one of the things that I caution people about, though, is that reading comprehension is not something that's super easy to change. So it takes time. MoCCA is something that I strongly recommend for screening, especially at the beginning of the year, and then intermittent kind of testing using sort of benchmarking windows. Assessing much more frequently than that is not really advisable, simply because the fine-grained changes that we hope that we are making in comprehension just tend not to show up on these assessments over time, or very quickly over time. If you think about Dibbles and the maze assessment, we only recommend progress monitoring for that monthly. So I would certainly not recommend doing MoCCA more often than that.
Okay. Let's see here. I think we have time for One more. Are there other processes besides inferencing we should take into consideration when looking at comprehension?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a lot involved in reading. It's a very complex cognitive process. When you think of the brain is hardwired to learn language, but it's not hardwired to learn how to read. And so some of the processes that go on are obviously word recognition, accessing word meanings. So our ability to connect our lexicon to the words that are sort of coming in as we visually scan a text. Inferencing is pretty much the heart of comprehension itself. I think maybe the only other process that I don't know that people have really figured out a way to measure is one's ability to sort of I don't know, I'm trying to come up with a user-friendly term for this, but to essentialize the text. What I mean by that is to reduce the text to its most central propositions. So this is something that Kinch and Van Dyke wrote about back in the 80s. And it has to do with sort of levels of understanding of a text, right? We've got the text base, which is the verbatim sort of representation of the text. Then we have the propositional level, which is where we kind of do what I'm calling essentializing, where we draw the most essential concepts from each sentence as we read it. And then above that is the mental model, or the situation model is another term that you may have heard. So inferencing really is pretty much the heart of it, though. So that finding the main idea is, yeah, that's sort of essentializing, right? Sorry, I just saw Rhoda's comment in the chat. Yeah, finding the main idea is part of essentializing a text. So sorry, I'm cognizant of the time. I could keep talking, but I don't think I'm allowed to.
No, absolutely. This was such interesting information, and clearly there's a hunger for more. And that's why we're really excited to continue the series over the next couple of days. And we'll be sending out all the resources that were shared today, including a link to the recording of this presentation that you are absolutely welcome to watch at your leisure and share with colleagues. Thank you again so much for joining this afternoon, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. And thank you, Dr. Bianca Rosa and Dr. D'Amico, for joining and your wonderful presentation. Take care, everyone.